Good evening, everyone. I'm David Asman in for Lou Dobbs. Let's get right back to the White House. Listen.
This point, I don't think so, huh? All right. Thank you all. Good. I wanted that to be a nice signature. That was Kevin, come on, fellas, come on over here. Elaine, what a job she's doing with transportation. How's transportation, okay?
Fine. You always talk about the supply chain.
I do.
It's really important.
I do.
This bill is going to help the supply chain and the workers.
Thank you very much. Anthony? Thank you. Thanks, Tony, very much. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.
Appreciate it.
Bob Lightheiser, thank you very much. Bob was a little less involved in this. He's too busy making trade deals. Okay, do you have one? Well, you definitely have to have one. Go ahead. You're all set. Thank you, everybody. So we're going to have a 5:30 news conference in the same location. Seems to be doing quite well. And we appreciate everything, and we really appreciate the fairness, at least from most of the press. We really do. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, there was a rare moment of agreement today between you and Senator Kerry over this issue with Massey. Could you expand a bit on that?
Well, he made a little joke about a man named Congressman Massey. I thought he was totally out of line, Congressman Massey. Because of that, I guess a lot of people had to come back. And they had to go into a place which, frankly, we're not supposed to be in, in light of what we're doing with Deborah and Tony and all of the professionals. So people had to come back, and there's just no reason for it. So John Kerry made a little joke out of it, and I agreed with his joke. And I said I never knew he had that kind of a personality, but we actually put it up, and he was right. Okay, we'll see you in a couple of minutes, folks. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Good job.
President Trump there signing into law the largest spending bill in U.S. history, $2 trillion for coronavirus relief package, one that needed some parliamentary tricks in order to get through Congress earlier in the day. The bill providing much needed relief to American working families and businesses. The president also set to speak, as he just said, at his daily coronavirus task force. Right now, it's scheduled for about 30 minutes from now. That may be delayed a little bit, which will also bring you live. Joining us now by Skype for a reaction to all of this is the host of this show, Mr. Lou Dobbs. A pleasure to see you, Lou. A very busy day for the president, for Congress. Not only did they get that package signed finally into law after some diddling on the part of Congress, but the president also invoking the Defense Production Act to get GM hopping on those ventilators. So it's just an extraordinarily busy day. Why don't you opine on all of what we've seen today?
Well, I'm delighted to be with you, David. Thank you so much. In opining on at least this $2 trillion stimulus package, they don't like it when you call it that, but that is precisely what it is. And for many, it is an outright rescue, millions of American workers. And I salute the president, the Congress, for moving, as you said. They dithered, but they dithered in Trump time. The reality is it took them just over a week to get this thing moved to reality, to signature. And I think that's very impressive. And yes, there was some agita along the way, but ultimately they served the interest of the American people, the American family, and small business and big as well. So I think it's I think they deserve a commendation. So I would offer that. Secondly, I think it's going to be incredibly effective, as well as great aid and comfort to those in this country who need it, namely those who've lost jobs already. And the incentives in this to keep workers on the job is unprecedented. It is a historic package, not only in terms of scale, but in terms of its content and its recognition that the American worker is the center along with the middle class of this country, to everything we are and do. So I am just tremendously enthused by what I've witnessed in Washington, D.C. And as you know, David, I'm not often enthused.
Not by what happens inside the Beltway, at any rate. Americans are responding, at least through the polls, with support for the president and his leadership specifically as regards the virus that is gripping America. Otherwise, they would be in a fearful state. And clearly they see a sense of leadership on the part of the White House that is not calming Americans, because there is a lot to be nervous about with regard to the virus, but at least assuring them that they're in good hands right now.
Yeah, his leadership has been steady and sure. I'm amazed at some of the criticism I've heard, even though we've heard it for 3.5 years almost, as he sits in the Oval Office. Even as he is succeeding, even as he is achieving exactly what he communicates to the American people, the national left-wing media continue to critique him, to suggest that he is somehow faltering. The reality is that what scares the left-wing media and the Democratic Party so much is that his leadership is so predictable. They want to try to brand him as some sort of eccentric, when in fact he drives straight down the middle. When you look at his policies and those that this stimulus bill addresses and supports, it is the broad swath of America. It is not on the left. It is not on the right. It is right down the middle where it ought to be. And one of the things, David, I don't think it's much attention on the part of the national left-wing media, like most of his successes, but he is communicating with the American people, the American voter, the middle class, those who aspire to it, working men and women, not the people who are sitting in Wall Street marble corner offices, but rather the people who are the absolute backbone of the country. And that money is going to them. Certainly not all of it, but more than they've ever seen in any previous economic emergency. He likes to call it a health emergency, and it is all that. But that health emergency has created a financial crisis of unfathomable and also unprecedented severity. We've never seen anything like this in such a quick time. These things normally take, as you know, as a student of economic history, sometimes years to unfold before us. Yeah. This was happening in 1 month, and it's extraordinary how quick the response is and how effective I believe it will be.
Well, and thankfully, he did get the deal done before the end of the week. I mean, we were mentioning the dithering that took place. And this time, initially, in the beginning of the week, by a Democrat, Mr. Schumer was trying to do it over in the Senate. Now, by a Republican, Mr. Massey in the House. But the president got the deal. The president was honest about it. He said, look, I don't like everything that's in here, but you got to get a deal done. Sometimes you have to swallow some bitterness in order to take the medicine that you need.
Well, Schumer and Massey are two, there's not an equivalency in my mind. Schumer knows better. He was playing terrible games, ideological games, and spiteful games as a representative of the party of hate. And I really hate to see that. He and Pelosi were, to me, as offensive and awful as they've been in their careers, in which they've tested the limits of awful several times. But this was not a great moment for Schumer and Pelosi, even though they finally at the end came to their senses and did the right thing for the American people. Congressman Massey is an individual force who decided he could block the will of the Congress, even though in all of his time in Congress, the man has not persuaded a single person to stand with him, you noticed, on any issue. He is an outlier of the worst kind, that is, aggressively so, trying to assert power over the direction of the institution as only one man who's incapable of persuading others of his view and his philosophy. So I find no excuse for him at all.
And now we have, looking to the future, the prospect of coming out of a dead stall for the economy, if you will, or close to it. And even Governor Cuomo of New York, who's been waffling one way or the other, he's now saying that that we can do both. We can lick the virus, through a partial shutdown and still get the economy, have parts of the economy moving. I'm not clear where he'll end up when his head stops spinning, but at least America now is looking to the future of restarting the economy.
Yeah. America will do that irrespective of Cuomo. Cuomo, I think we have to put in context his leadership on this. He was late. De Blasio, for crying out loud, the mayor of New York City, was ahead of him in terms of addressing this crisis. And then Cuomo steps in as if he is some sort of a savior rather than a failed leader. It was he who did not buy ventilators when he should have bought them. And it was his responsibility to do so. But instead, he's buying solar panels, for crying out loud. And then he depended entirely upon the federal government and the Trump administration, thanks them very much. Then he attacks them because he thinks in his studied leadership that he should have been consulted. This is a man who has done nothing for New York, and it is the epicenter of this outbreak. It has the largest number of victims, and that is the responsibility of the mayor of New York City and the governor of this state. And he is trying to alternate between being martyr, being critic, and also, by the way, failed leader of the state that has much to account for as a result of this extraordinary outbreak, the worst in the nation, the worst, in fact, outside of Wuhan.
Lou, we have to jump, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention this
don't
is
jump,
the last.
David, whatever you do.
I'm on the first floor, so don't worry. I can't get hurt if I do jump.
Okay.
But this is the last day of your quarantine, I'm happy to mention, and
Yes,
we will see you back in this seat on Monday, right?
And it's the last day of quarantine for the entire staff of Lou Dobbs Tonight.
Excellent.
I'm happy to say.
It's wonderful
and
news.
Everyone is healthy, able, and eager to get back to work Monday.
It's a great
Thank you so
milestone.
much, David. You've been terrific throughout the week.
It's my pleasure. Anytime.
And we certainly appreciate it.
And we'll be happy to see you back here on Monday. Thank you, Lou. Have a great weekend. Appreciate it.
You too. All the best.
The United Nations using fear to push globalism during the coronavirus pandemic. Their chief economist for food and agriculture, Maximo Torero, is warning of global food shortages, saying, quote, all measures against free trade will be counterproductive. Now is not the time for restrictions or putting in place trade barriers. Now is the time to protect the flow of food around the world, end quote. Well, U.S. Agricultural Secretary Sonny Perdue told this program last week that America's food supply is secure and Americans should not worry about any such food shortages. Meanwhile, the national media is stooping to the point of writing propaganda for the Chinese Communist Party. A new NBC News article stating that, quote, with Italy in dire need of medical equipment, an economic superpower stepped in to help. No, not the United States. It was China, end quote. China, of course, where the deadly virus started. The Communist Party there covered up its severity, hindering the rest of the world's ability to respond. We also told you last night about the testing kits that China provided to countries like Spain and Italy that didn't work. China has also charged many countries millions of dollars for their so-called help that they labeled as donations. Well, joining me now is Peter Navarro, assistant to the president's trade czar in the White House and member of the president's coronavirus task force. Peter, great to see you.
Hey, David, look, you look marvelous, but you know, we miss Lou, so a little shout out for Mr. Dobbs.
All right, he's coming. You'll get him full board beginning next week on Monday. Believe me, he's back in style next week.
Up.
Absolutely. Well, I just talked to a CEO today who does a lot of work with China, and he said, okay, we hear a lot of people talking about how we need the China solution because China got it right, et cetera. He said China used the army to enforce its lockdown. Anybody seen walking down the street or where they didn't think they should be, they'd haul them into a tank or some military vehicle, send them to a place that was under lockdown, literally under lockdown. Is that really what Americans want now, Peter?
Well, I think the most graphic picture that struck me in China was when the military was literally welding people into their apartment buildings and not letting them out. Here's what I'm doing. First of all, David, my mission here at the White House, and my office is about 50 yards across the way there. I'm trying to make sure that the people of America get the gloves, the goggles, all the personal protective equipment, the ventilators, and I'm spending all my time on that on behalf of President Trump, to making sure we have what we need. And what I'm seeing here, our approach, our strategy, President Trump's strategy, is take the full force of the federal government, the full power of private enterprise, and then the full cooperation of the American people in terms of their mitigation measures and social distancing to attack this problem from multiple vectors. And it's a very different model from what China's doing. What I've seen so far with the full power of the private sector is a tremendous outpouring of cooperation from companies, small, medium, and large. And what we're seeing is, in some case, the repurposing of factories. We've had a company like Pernod Ricard, which makes liquor. It's now sending hand sanitizer by truck into New York City as we speak. We've seen companies like Honeywell expand their production and open new plants in places like Smithfield, Rhode Island. Mm-hmm. And FedEx has been beautiful in terms of helping the White House when I had to move 800,000 swabs out of Italy on a Mill Air flight into Memphis. They were there waiting to disperse those swabs to 6 different cities. So every time I've made a phone call to a CEO in this country, they've given this president in this country their best, and I get phone calls unsolicited all the time from private enterprise asking us, what can we do? You take someone like Phoebe Novakovic, CEO of General Dynamics. I spoke with her over the weekend, last weekend. I said, Phoebe, what do you got? You got anything in inventory in terms of N95 mask, any protective equipment? And guess what? Within a matter of days, we had 4,500 Tyvek suits. Those are gold, 2,200 Kimberly-Clark Series A suits, and we got them coming from 12 different cities into New York City to help with that. So there's a lot of companies that I could mention, Sloan, SureWorks, and one other that's, I think it's really beautiful, the National Council of Textile Organizations. It's the Fruit of the Loom, Hanes, Parkdale Mills. They reached out to us, and right now as we speak, they're repurposing their factories to make face masks. And I couldn't be more prouder of this country, this president, this government, and that's what we're doing here at the White House.
Well, let me just talk about another company, which is GM, and they have been criticized by some in the administration, including the president, for not churning out as many ventilators as the president wanted. He has invoked the Defense Production Act. He said he hasn't had to. You've said he hasn't had to before this because the companies have been doing what you asked for. Why was it necessary to invoke that act? And what do you hope to get out of it from GM? I know they're working with Ventec as well to produce these ventilators.
I love that question because I was in the Oval Office when the president signed that order, and it was a great order for him to sign, and here's why. Again, my office is working with FEMA, HHS, with about more than 10 different ventilator companies working on contracts to get these things going. And if you contrast, for example, the Ford-GE partnership to make ventilators, right? Ford is like, they make cars just like GM. They're going to start making ventilators with GE, which has the expertise. It's like they went off and did that voluntarily. They make no demands. All these other ventilator companies are cooperating. What was different about GE was it was like, show me the money before they would move. And
now, forgive me, Peter, you said GE. You're talking about GM here, right?
GE and Ford, voluntary effort to repurpose their factory. They're doing a heck of a job. Just patriotic Americans.
But Peter, forgive me, but we're running out of time. I have to ask you about General Motors. Forgive me, but I have to ask you about General Motors. Go ahead.
That's what I'm telling you. The GM Ventec partnership was more about money than getting it done today. Okay, and I saw all this happen in real time. I was involved in a lot of discussions, and the president said, look, we need ventilators. They got to stop messing around. So today he signed that order, and when we need to use the DPA, this president is going to use the DPA to get what the American people need, and that needed to be done today.
Very quickly, 10,000 ventilators per month. That's what GM claims that they can come up with now, beginning in mid-April. Are you going to hold them to that number?
No, that won't be what they will produce. There's got to be a ramp up with them.
Okay.
We hope for as much as 40 to 80,000 at some point at the end of the year. But more importantly, David, we got at least 10 other companies. But just before I came on the air, I was sitting across the street with a guy from FEMA, and we were talking to all these ventilator companies saying, what do you got? What can you get us now? What can you get us over the next 30, 60, 90 days through the end of June? And you know what? We're trying as hard as we possibly can to make sure every American gets what they need, every healthcare worker, and this is so important, David. We cannot afford to lose a single healthcare worker to COVID, because that just disrupts the whole thing.
Unfortunately,
goggles,
we already
gloves,
have, Peter.
that.
That's the problem, and we got to stop it. But again, congratulations on your work mobilizing the U.S. workforce and those great U.S. companies with the efforts that the president is making. We've got to move on, but thank you very much for being here, Peter.
We're moving in Trump time.
Really appreciate it.
Fast as possible.
And we'd like to hear your thoughts on all of this. Share your comments and follow Lou on Twitter at Lou Dobbs. Like him on Facebook and follow him on Instagram at Lou Dobbs Tonight. The president's coronavirus response coordinator, Dr. Deborah Birx, warning the media about using pandemic projections instead of the actual data of cases on the ground. Take a listen.
Models are models. We're adapting now to the reality. There's enough data now of the real experience with the coronavirus on the ground to really make these predictions much more sound. So when people start talking about 20% of a population getting infected, it's very scary. But we don't have data that matches that based on the experience.
Joining me now is Dr. Ashish Jha, director of the Harvard Global Health Institute. Doctor, great to see you again. Thank you for being here. So, Dr. Birx, if I could just put it in a nutshell, saying that we've never collected as much data as we have for this particular pandemic because we have this great communication around the world that we didn't have for previous pandemics. That should inform us more than projections based on previous pandemics. What do you think?
Well, so Dr. Birx is, of course, right that we want to use as much real-life data as possible. I think what we ultimately want to get to is a combination. Those models tell us something about how diseases work. We know how diseases work. We know how they infect people. And then, of course, we've got to tie that in with real-life experience. So my feeling is we've got to put both of them together and really try to understand what it's teaching us, not one or the other, because they're both important.
But let me just give you an example. Yesterday on a competing business network, the name of which I shall remain anonymous, they said that the COVID-19 outbreak could be deadlier than the 1917 Spanish flu. Now, that killed 50 million people. It doesn't seem like the death rate is going to be anywhere close to the Spanish flu, does it? I mean, not to do anything to diminish the importance or the severity of coronavirus, but I'm just saying, compared to the Spanish flu, I don't think we're going to hit those numbers. Do you?
I don't think we're going to hit 50 million around the world. I sure hope not, and I think there's good reason to believe we won't. Those are very scary numbers. Remember, 100 years ago, we didn't have the kind of healthcare system we have now. We didn't have the kind of data and prediction abilities that we have now. We didn't have treatments the way we are working on trying to develop. So I am cautiously optimistic. No one knows, of course, but that I don't think we're going to end up with the kind of numbers that we saw with the Spanish flu. But it's up to us. If we do a good job on managing this, we should be able to do much better than that.
Well, and frankly, we're already doing a much better job than a country like Italy, at least in terms of our mortality rate. Theirs is over 10% or close to it. Ours is about 1.5%.
Yeah, look, I want to caution everybody on mortality right now because we're early, right? So if you think about it, it's entirely possible, and I'm hopeful that we'll stay at 1.5%, maybe even go down as we do more testing. But we've got a lot of sick people in the hospital, and if a lot of them end up dying, then our mortality rate goes up. So I don't think there's any reason we should end up with the kind of numbers that we saw in Italy. But again, if we do a good job of getting people in, flattening that curve so that people aren't getting infected at very high rates, we should definitely be able to come in under where Italy is.
Well, let's talk about the availability of equipment right here in the United States, because we just saw the executive order come out. The president has used a presidential act to get GM to work and produce more ventilators. Do you think we'll have them in time? Right now, there's already a squeeze going on. It's going to take a couple of weeks to churn up these production lines to get the ventilators out. Will we have enough?
It's a great question. I'm worried that in some places, New York is going to face a real crunch in the next couple of weeks. So I'm worried about whether New York is going to have enough. These production ramp-ups aren't going to be able to meet New York's needs. So we're going to have to come up with some other approach to get New York through this. But it's not just New York, right? Because I'm worried that in a week or 10 days, we're going to hit New Orleans is going to be in trouble. There'll be other cities, Atlanta. And so we just need a national strategy while we're ramping up to help these cities get through it, because city after city is going to be going through this over the next weeks and months.
And the health workers, I mean, you can't say enough. I think that they are the real heroes, if there are any, in this whole situation. I mean, there are some regular men on the street, women on the street heroes as well. But you look at what the health care workers do day after day after day. Dr. Fauci said there may be a vaccine available for health workers in the fall. Do you know anything about that?
No, I know that there are a lot of people working on vaccines. There's about 6 different candidates, a couple in China, some here, Europe. I'm not aware that any of them will be ready for the fall. But Dr. Fauci's got his finger on the pulse better than I do. But my sense is that we're probably 9 to 12 months away. But it's possible that if we're making progress, we could try it out on health workers first. They really are the heroes.
Well, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think what he was indicating is that there could be a way of fast-tracking something that might not be a vaccine that might not be available or ready because of testing for the general population, because the need is so great by the healthcare workers. They could be essentially the ones to test it out.
That's entirely possible. And look, they are the highest risk. We need to protect healthcare workers. And so if we have, let's say, a small batch, we don't have enough for the whole country, you can imagine going to healthcare workers first.
Dr. Ashish Jha, always a pleasure to see you, Doctor. Please come and see us again. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
We have some breaking news. The FBI apparently knew about Hillary Clinton emails found on Anthony Weiner's laptop a month before seeking a search warrant. Judicial Watch has uncovered an email from disgraced FBI agent Peter Strzok, which refers to the, quote, Weiner timeline. Strzok mentioning that the FBI's New York office was aware of the Clinton emails on September 28th, 2016. A request for the search warrant came on October 30th, interestingly, just a few days before the 2016 election. Joining us now is John Solomon, award-winning investigative reporter, Fox Business contributor, and the editor-in-chief of his new media outlet, Just the News. Good to see you, John. Let's start with that, if you don't mind. We've been focused so much on the virus. There is other news going on. I find it interesting that the search warrant for this particular, the emails on the Weiner laptop came just a couple of days before the election, even though they were sitting on it for about a month. Clearly, they didn't want it to interfere with Hillary's chances for winning the election. That's how I read it anyway. What about you?
Well, you aren't the only one. If you remember now, go back to the Inspector General's report from 2 years ago that looked at the Hillary Clinton emails. They said something very profound. They didn't find any evidence of bias affecting the Russia investigation, but they did believe there was a possibility of bias affecting the decision to delay looking at these new emails and to prioritize the Russia investigation against Trump. Similarly, we now know why. That 1 month gap is so significant. It's unusual for the FBI to set on the evidence of potential criminality for a month. It just doesn't happen. And that probably explains that passage that we all were wondering about a couple of years ago in the IG report from Michael Horowitz.
And again, it just shows how political the FBI was and how right the president was to try to strip that politics out. Has he succeeded? I mean, does it still have problems that we need to address?
It's certainly running a lot better under Chris Wray. I talk to a lot of people there often. There's a sense of just getting back to work, doing the things the FBI did all along, not letting politics hijack. And the biggest change they're making, they're not pulling cases out of the field and taking them to headquarters where they can be meddled with by politicos. They're staying in the field. That's a big win for the FBI, and I think there's a lot to be proud of there today.
All right. Well, meanwhile, let's get back to the virus. And interesting to note that the National Institutes of Health had a chance to study drugs related to the coronavirus, and had they done so, we might have been better prepared to deal with those infected. Instead, they were studying drunk monkeys, soap operas, and tailgating. Yeah. I mean, what's up if that doesn't tell you why the government is unfit to run the healthcare system? I don't know what will.
Well, it is a powerful story. You know, I've got a lot of family members who are cops, EMTs, and nurses on the front line of this right in Connecticut, New York area. They wonder, why don't we have some of these medicines tested? Because back in 2003, there were emerging data showing that certain things like chloroquine and other things, something that the president mentioned recently, might work. But no one went ahead and did a clinical study on these things. And so 15 years passed. I went back and said, well, what did the NIH do during those 15 years? And the studies that we found would make most people fall off their chair in disbelief. You'll think it's a bad comedy act, except the American taxpayer paid tens of millions of dollars for things like what happens if monkeys drink a lot. Well, they get drunk, they become alcoholic, and they have bad tissue. It's a pretty simple study. But we spent millions on that. And I think that when we come back after this, when we get through this coronavirus case, there's going to be a reckoning for the NIH community, National Institutes of Health, which funds all this research. $40 billion a year. We should have been able to find the money to find those antidotes for coronavirus long before this pandemic broke out.
One would think, one would hope that some of that, hopefully, will be addressed as the money is spent from this $2 trillion plan that we worked on today. Yeah. John Solomon, Just the News is the organization. Thank you, John. Good to see you. Appreciate it.
Boeing just announced that they're going to be making the plastic face shields, the actual shields, which are hard to come by, and they're going to be making them by the thousands a week. And the ventilators, which is probably the most difficult because it's like building a car. We will be announcing thousands are going to be built, and we have them under contract.
President Trump just moments ago talking about American companies building much-needed medical equipment for the heroic doctors and nurses who are helping to fight the coronavirus. He is expected to expand on that during his daily press briefing, expected to start now at the top of the hour. On Wall Street, stocks closed lower today. The Dow fell 915 points, the S&P down 89, the Nasdaq falling 295 points. Volume on the big board, 6.2 billion shares. The market finished strong for the end of the week. The Dow up nearly 13%. The S&P gained 10%. The Nasdaq up 9%. And a reminder to listen to Lou's reports 3 times a day, coast to coast, on the Salem Radio Network. Well, Planned Parenthood and several abortion activist groups are suing Texas Governor Greg Abbott for imposing a suspension on non-essential surgeries, including abortions, during the coronavirus pandemic. Planned Parenthood says abortions are essential and demand that they continue, but won't allow people with coronavirus symptoms at its facilities. Well, the New York Times today publishing an op-ed blaming evangelical Christians for the coronavirus pandemic and not China. The piece, titled "The Road to Coronavirus Hell Was Paved by Evangelicals," argues that because religious voters supported President Trump, that means he governs without regard for science. Joining me now, Pastor Robert Jeffers, member of the White House Faith Initiative, pastor of the First Baptist Church of Dallas, Fox Business contributor, and host of Fox Nation's Pathway to Victory. Pastor, I have a feeling you have something to say about this New York Times article. Are evangelicals the cause for the virus?
That is absolutely absurd, David. And look, it's true. Every group has some fanatics on the fringe. I mean, there are nut jobs in every group, whether it be evangelicals, the media, or the Democrat Party. But the fact is, even though there are a few evangelicals who are flaunting what the CDC and president are recommending about large groups, most pastors like my church are following this regulation and these great suggestions to keep our people safe. And David, what's really going on here is the New York Times and the left, they're trying to separate the president from his evangelical supporters. They know an election is coming up soon. They know the president's on the glide path to re-election and that evangelicals are key to that. They're trying to cause a break in that relationship, and that's not going to happen.
Well, and the fact is that their anti-Christian bias, which is just as bad as a bias against Muslims, a bias against Jews, a bias against any ethnic or religious group, is just absurd and is so ignorant of the facts that a lot of pastors, a lot of priests have contributed enormously to science through centuries. Talk about anything with regard to astrophysics, with regard to genetical research. I mean, it's extraordinary, the contribution of Christians to science. The fact that they would publish this in the New York Times is amazing to me.
Well, it shows that the only group that they feel like they can discriminate against as far as religious groups are evangelical Christians. And you're right. Evangelical Christians have led the way in science. Pascal, Newton, so many, Louis Pasteur, so many have been Christians. So this is just garbage.
All right. Let's move on to the Planned Parenthood story, if you could. They're suing the Texas governor for calling abortions non-essential surgery. That is, they're suing the governor for calling abortions non-essential surgery. Your thoughts on that?
Look, the governor is absolutely right. It is absurd that Planned Parenthood and these other abortion lobbyists would actually put the lives of medical technicians at risk. They would be willing to tie up our medical facilities during this coronavirus crisis, all in an effort to preserve their so-called right to murder children. This is absurd. And look, to be fair, I don't believe every Democrat believes it is essential surgery, abortion, but I'll guarantee you just about everybody who believes it's an essential surgery, abortion, is a Democrat. And David, I've got a suggestion. I think some enterprising reporter ought to take just a couple of minutes off from attacking President Trump and ask the Democrat presumptive nominee, Joe Biden, this simple question. Mr. Biden, do you believe that abortion should be considered essential surgery during the coronavirus crisis? What do you think about that? And I think his answer would be very illuminating.
Well, it's a very interesting question, particularly since Mr. Biden claims to be a practicing Catholic as well.
That's right. And was denied communion in his own church because of his barbaric view on abortion.
Yeah. We have the president now in a situation where his approval rating for the way he's dealing with the virus it just continues to go up. Americans think that he's doing a good job, but everything you read in the media and everything we've talked about for the past hour has a negative spin on what he has done. The Americans do seem to be reading between the headlines, reading between the lines that they continue to get from the media. Is that encouraging to you? Does it say something about the way society is working now and their relationship with the media?
It does, David. You know, in 2015 and 2016, I had all kinds of people ask me the question, why do you support Donald Trump for president? He's this, he's that. And I would always say, Donald Trump may not be a perfect Christian. None of us is, but he is a great leader, and that's what America needs. I never knew how true those words would become until this present crisis. I believe Donald Trump is a fearless leader with the rugged resolve necessary to navigate us through this coronavirus crisis. And the whole American public is seeing that before their very eyes.
But specifically, the American public's view of the media, is it because so much of what they have written has turned out not to be true? Why do you think it's happening?
I tell you, the media has a lower approval rating with the American people than used car salesmen and insurance salesmen and crooked televangelists. I mean, they have no respect for the media whatsoever because of the lies they continue to perpetrate.
Tell me about how we come out of this, Pastor, because we are looking now, obviously we have a lot of hard work in front of us. The numbers in New York, where I live, just continue to get worse and worse with regard to the virus. Actually, I'm not going to be able to ask you the whole question because the president is talking with the task force. Let's listen in.
Great to have you. And thank you all for being here. My administration is taking new action to ensure that America has the medical resources and equipment needed to fight the global pandemic. It's been a brutal pandemic for over 150 countries all over the world. We've had great success over the last month. As you know, the millions and millions of pieces of equipment have been delivered successfully by us, purchased and delivered, and we've made it available to the states. And the governors have been very gracious for the most part, I would say. There are a couple that aren't appreciative of the incredible job. They have to do a better job themselves. That's part of the problem. But generally speaking, I have to tell you, the governors have been great. I just spoke to the governor of New Jersey, Governor Murphy, and he's very thankful. And Governor Cuomo has been very nice. They've really appreciated, I think, what the federal government has done. You look at the hospitals that are being built all over the country by the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA. It's been really incredible. Nobody's seen it. They'll build hospitals in 2 or 3 days, portable hospitals. This afternoon, I invoke the Defense Production Act to compel General Motors to accept, perform, and prioritize federal contracts for ventilators. Ventilators are a big deal, and we've delivered thousands of them. And oftentimes you don't need ventilators very much. Hospitals don't have very many. And now we're turning out that we have to produce large numbers. But we've been able to do that, and we're going to be doing a lot more. This invocation of the DPA should demonstrate clearly to all that we will not hesitate to use the full authority of the federal government to combat this crisis. We thought that we had to deal with, as an example, General Motors, and I guess they thought otherwise. They didn't agree. And now they do. They do agree, and I think we might be able to pull it, but we let them know the way we felt, and they can't be doing that. We'll work in partnership with the private sector, but where an emergency exists, and it's very important that we get to the bottom line, and quickly we will do what we have to do and immediately exercise all available lawful authorities to get the job done. This afternoon, I also signed an executive order investing, and very, very strongly investing, the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Homeland Security with the full authorities available under the Defense Production Act to respond to the outbreak of the terrible virus, the invisible enemy, as we say. My order also establishes that Peter Navarro, a very trusted person from the White House, and he's done an incredible job for me in terms of negotiation, in terms of understanding where the world is going economically. But my order establishes that Peter will serve as National Defense Production Act Policy Coordinator for the federal government. That's a very important position, more important probably than it's almost ever been in our country. And so I want to congratulate Peter and his family. I know he's going to do a fantastic job. He's been doing that job over the last few weeks. Peter is a PhD in economics from Harvard, has a master in public administration from the Kennedy School, also from Harvard. And he's a tremendous guy, and he will do a fantastic job. And I'd like to maybe ask, before I continue, Peter to say a few words, please. Peter?
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you
President.
very much.
And of course, you know the Harvard joke. You can tell a Harvard man, you just can't tell them much, right?
They can't tell
So,
them.
anyway, on a serious note, let me just give you a little idea of the Defense Production Act and why it is so important. We are engaged in the most significant industrial mobilization since World War II. We have a wartime president fighting an invisible enemy, and we have the full force of government coupled with the full power of private enterprise bearing down on this problem for the American people, sir. What we had to do today with President Trump's order with respect to General Motors, I want to give you a little background on that. We need industrial mobilization to make adequate ventilators, particularly in the very short run, to help the people of New York, Detroit, New Orleans, Chicago, Denver, Seattle, all around this country as this virus bears down. And the ventilators really are the most important thing for patients who become most seriously ill. They are literally the lifeline for people. And I've personally been working with FEMA, and I've been working with HHS and over 10 ventilator companies, making sure we can get what we need as quickly as possible. And virtually every one of those companies has been cooperative, patriotic, moving in Trump time, which is to say as soon as possible, sir. But we did have a problem with GM and Ventec. On the one hand, we had Ford and GE moving forward on a similar kind of project, patriotically moving as fast as possible. Over the last several days, we ran into roadblocks with GM. We cannot afford to lose a single day, particularly over the next 30 to 60 days. So President Trump invoked the Defense Production Act as a way of enhancing and accelerating this mobilization. I salute him for doing so. It's going to make my job so much easier. For the most part, we've had tremendous cooperation from the private sector. Today, sir, was the right day to do it. Thank you, sir. Thank you.